Commission. He recently presented the body's final report to the president. As a bureaucrat and later a politician, he's been a key influencer in policy decisions, many of which he talks about in his recently published autobiography, Portraits of Power: Half a Century of Being at Ringside. Mr. Singh will be in conversation today with economist Shankaracharya, who was India's longest serving chief economic advisor for 8 years, from 1993 to 2001. He will be joined by Anand Goenka, Executive Director, The Indian Express, and P. Redinathan Iyer, Executive Editor for National Affairs, The Indian Express. Before beginning the session, I would like to thank our presenting partner, Reliance Industries Limited, and associate partner, RP Sanjeev Goenka Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. Welcome, Mr. Singh, Dr. Acharya. It is such a pleasure to host you both. To call Mr. Singh a politician would be a grave injustice because given his exceptional stint in public service, and similarly, I wouldn't want to venture and call him just a bureaucrat as well. His book, The Portraits of Power, which gives you a ringside view, and Mr. Singh in the ring himself, is an essential read in my mind, because I've gone through the book in good detail. Is an essential read for all those who are interested in not just contemporary politics, but also policy making in India. Mr. Singh, if I may just kick off the conversation, we have just seen the outcome of the Bihar elections. Mr. Nitish Kumar has sworn in along with several ministers. But as we covered the elections on the ground, we were kind of hearing this a lot from our reporters, saying that there is this huge anti-incumbency factor playing in. How do you read the verdict today as the ministers take oath in Bihar?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the Indian Express. Thank you for hosting me for this edition of the Express Adda. And thank you for the warm words, which you have spoken, and also in the introduction. It's a difficult question which you have posed. Just by sheer coincidence, the last book which I wrote was about Bihar. It was jointly edited by Lord Nicholas Stern of the London School of Economics and myself on what I called at that time the New Bihar. And the essence of that book, if I may say so, was that will Bihar ever grow out of the stratified social order and be able to merge the kind of stratified caste and class and other distinctions with greater mobility of labor and capital horizontally and vertically in the Bihar society, and whether development politics will ever trump identity politics. And as I see the entire Bihar election, I see the play of identity politics and development politics. One of the important factors, I think, which it played out in Bihar was that the central leadership, the Prime Minister, was clearly able to carry the message to an average voter psyche that he was opting decisively for development and that identity politics should increasingly occupy a lower priority. So I read the Bihar election as a reaffirmation of an average Bihari's quest for better life quality, not being forced out of Bihar into migratory patterns driven by compulsions of poverty, quest for better education, a quest for better health, and all electoral choices and electoral psyche is driven by options. They opted for development in comparison to identity politics.
Very interesting, Mr. Singh, which you said that, that the Prime Minister was able to carry forward the message and cutting across, across sections of the society there. Which brings me to a very interesting point that you make in your book. on probably whether there is a need for, or probably is there a time to rethink constitutional reforms. You introspect and talk a lot about the Westminster model, actually, of parliamentary democracy uh, being kind of de jure, if not de jure, but then de facto replaced by the presidential model. So that's something, an observation which you make. So now that when you say that it was the prime minister who carried the message so clearly, what do you think about this kind of feature playing out in India and the rest of the world?
So, Mehdi, you have raised an important issue, which I touch in my book in some detail, particularly if you look at the chapter on the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, the relationship between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office. I do point out that initially, in the first few years of our independence, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru really was served by what Lord Wavell had described in a letter which he had written, to say that the Cabinet Office, namely the Secretary to the Cabinet, was also the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister. And he writes, with perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that this was to deliberately prevent Nehru from going astray and from the institution of the Cabinet Office being in any way diluted. This tradition continued for very long. It continued till the diminutive Lal Bahadur Shastri decided to appoint NK Singh for the first time as Secretary to the Prime Minister. Namely, the Secretary to the Prime Minister then had an identity distinct from the Cabinet Secretary. And for the first time at that time, which I have mentioned in the book, Vaidi, the rules of transactional business were amended. They were amended to have a new insert in the rules, namely the recognition of the Prime Minister's office as an entity recognized under the transactional business rules. That was, if you ask me, a watershed point. Now, over a period of time, the relationship between the Cabinet Office and the Prime Minister's office has been an evolving dynamics, depending on the temperament and depending on the needs of the time. They have settled a kind of a working equilibrium. But let's not forget two important things. First, which you have mentioned, is about what are the global tendencies. If you look at global tendencies, you are seeing the emergence of strong leaders as prime ministers. How many of us thought that the electoral mandate in the United Kingdom was being sought in the name of who was the likely Home Secretary or who was going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer? They knew that the candidate for the Prime Minister in the United Kingdom was Boris Johnson. And if you look at other patterns too, in some ways, this is beginning to already dilute the traditional Westminster model, because the Westminster model is based on one central principle: the Prime Minister is the first among equals. The moment that is really altered, you altered the gene particles of the Westminster model. And why is this so? This is because, after all, votes are garnered, votes are realized, elections are won on the basis of who is going to lead the country. It's of hardly much relevance to an average voter, increasingly, in a world and in a society so interdependent by the power of the media, by the power of technology, by the power of what expectations are, by aspirations are. It does not matter what kind of a governance institutional framework he has. What matters to him is who is more likely to deliver on the aspirations which they expect from any elected government. And the altered nature of technology and aspirations have to a large extent been important factors in diluting the traditional rubric of the Westminster model. And as you have mentioned, and I mentioned this in my book, if not de jure, then de facto. And it is this unsettled equilibrium in which the Cabinet Office then increasingly becomes the traditional role Namely, the cabinet secretary is the secretary to the council of ministers. The secretary to the prime minister is to carry out the orders, initiatives of the prime minister. So this is really, if you ask me, the new model which seems to be emerging globally. By the way, not only in terms of the management of the central government, powerful chief ministers who have been successful chief ministers have also adopted the similar replication of this model. Whatever that might mean, it must mean that who are the entities, who is the leader, in whom the voters have demonstrated not only their support, but have opted for. So it is the changing voter psychology all over the world, which has been the most important guiding factor in moving away from whatever traditional models of governance which you may have. And by the way, the pandemic has demonstrated one more thing, which I have brought out in my chapter on pandemic and beyond, namely that the very important role of a central unifying factor in being able to work out social security systems, in expectations that in the post-pandemic period, you may have to do a reset button. You may have, in fact, to write a new social contract, a social contract which embeds many more features than the traditional social contract has.
Mr. Singh, you just had this incredible breadth of experience, and we're seeing, you're seeing this kind of a strong, as you've said in your book, you're seeing a very strong prime minister, both in Indira Gandhi and now with Modi, and all the different types of prime ministers we've had in the middle. In your experience, where do you think that the autonomy given to bureaucrats, A, B, the strength of democratic institutions, where do you think, in which of these two models do you find, democratic institutions actually thrive more?
That's a very good question, if I may say so. So there are no perfect answers. There would be no perfect fits either. And I think that what we need to opt for is a hybrid mix between the two. The permanent bureaucracy has an important role to play. It's the most important institution, particularly in a federal polity like ours, which, if you ask me, the permanent civil service is that which lends permanence to any volatilities and uncertainties in the governance rubric. They have an important role to play, fearlessly being able to put across their point of view, leaving the policy options to the political masters. And I think that role will continue to be an important role. In this framework, of course, there are other questions that does meritocracy always pay off? The changing dynamics, do other factors come into play? But as I said, there is no perfect answer. There is no perfect fit. There will be a hybrid which seeks to combine the virtues of many different types of governance models.
Dr. Acharya, if I can bring you in, this notion that coalition governments have actually delivered more reform, have been more decisive and faster with economic reform. Do you subscribe to that view? And do you see that post-COVID, that rule of coalition governments actually doing more reform actually changing now after COVID?
Well, Anand, first of all, let me thank you and your colleagues in the Express for inviting me on this occasion. And before I get to your question, I also want to say, NK, that we all owe you a great debt of gratitude in giving us a very fine book to read and read carefully, to ponder over, and where necessary, perhaps disagree. It would not be a good book if one couldn't sometimes disagree with it. I think what I particularly like about your book was, first, it's of course enormous scope, not just across time, which you highlight in the title, but also across the subject matter. one day it's about, or one chapter is about police, then it's about growing roses in Japan, and then it's about good old finance ministry. So I think all of that, and of course, all sorts of other stuff going on. The other thing I like very much is that you really get into a lot of the gory detail behind policy initiatives, policies sometimes that go wrong. So there's a lot of flesh and blood, sometimes blood on the floor, which I think makes it a very, very interesting read. So I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope there'll be many thousands of others who will do so. Coming to your question, Anand. It's a very good question. It's also been, I think, debated at times. In my view, I'd like to say a couple of things, and I'd be interested in NK's views on this. First of all, I'm not sure that we have got enough data points to really come to a definitive view. I think there is evidence on either side. In the Indian context, and particularly if I think on the economic side and over the last 40 years, with which I'm more familiar, I'm struck that in my view, two of the best periods for economic policy, both policy and reforms, in my view, were the Narasimha Rao government years, that is from 1991 to 96, and the Vajpayee years from 1998 to 2004. I wonder if NK, you agree with this. But now it happens that both of them were, at one time or other, coalitions. But I would not jump from that's the only way to get good economic policy. I don't think we have enough data points to come to that. But I would like to ask you, NK, if I can make this a triangular conversation, that first of all, do you agree with my possibly rather bold characterization, and I'm taking 40, 50 years of Indian economic history, that two of the richest periods for good economic policy were the Narasimha Rao years, which was essentially a Congress government, and the Vajpayee years, which was a BJP-centered coalition, in shorthand, a BJP government. And if they were, they essentially span almost 13 years with a hiatus in between. What are the things that, I mean, we happened to be both of us in government at the same time around then and overlapped a lot. And from my side, I can say it was a great pleasure to have that overlap. Obviously, a lot of things got done. But when you look back, and if you were being sort of quite searching in your looking back, what do you think are the things that we should have done better in those 13, 14 years by way of economic policy?
Well, Shankar, let me first and foremost thank you profoundly for your very warm words of appreciation. I know, Shankar, which I have mentioned in my book, you choose your words very carefully. You are one of the most precise minds which government has ever seen. And also not only a precise mind, but very definitive mind in terms of what you suggest, irrespective of whether that is really carried forward or not. So let me thank you profoundly for your very warm and very endearing comments. It was a great pleasure to have worked with you in the Ministry of Finance during that long period. And your role as a chief economic advisor, if I may say so, which I have hoped I have tried to bring out in my book, is something which I think was an important contributor in enabling India to handle some of the key challenges which we confronted at that time. Your question to me is in two parts. First, I think it responds to Anand's question. You have mentioned that the two very good governments which delivered enormously on the important economic reforms both happened to be coalition governments and not governments which were measured in that sense of the term. And Of course, I take it that the current period of Prime Minister Modi is an ongoing period, but we have to recognize that there are some important reform initiatives which have been undertaken by the current government. So at the moment, I'm reserving my comments on that. Perhaps I get an opportunity to do so. I want to make two observations to your comment. First, Shankar, suppose we both asked ourselves the mutual question that in case the Narasimha Rao government had been what it was, in case Manmohan Singh was the finance minister, what he was, but India did not have a balance payments crisis, that India was not on the verge of a default. If we ask ourselves a question, how much of those reforms were acts of conscious choice as products of compulsion? I wonder what the reply would be. I have sought to argue that we seem to be a nation acting with an amazing amount of coordination in moments of crisis, but that complacency sets in rather quickly. This would be the first one comment. Having said this, the Vajpayee government being the first BJP government in any sense of the term, which followed thereafter, wanted to naturally improve on the record, both on the economic and the political side, to what he had inherited. So on the political side, of course, which has been recounted in some detail here in the book, he took the audacious step, notwithstanding sanctions which it invited, of India becoming a nuclear power. And that achieved the amazing thing of then going on to have a strategic partnership with the United States, even during his own period. Equally, on the economic side, he continued with some far-reaching important economic reforms, which were left somewhat incomplete in the 91 to 93 period of economic reforms. To your second question, what did we fail to achieve in the 13 years? Well, again, Shankar, I want to raise the issue that you and I know that we got out of the fund bank arrangement in 1993. We got off, not because the two of us were part of it, we got off rather lightly, if I may say so, by the hindsight. And that having got off the fund bank arrangement, we perhaps felt that there was no compulsion to undertake some other important reforms which would have made a qualitative difference. What were these? These were structural reforms, reforms in the factors of production, in terms of land, labor. The financial sector reforms went in on a back burner. That has come to haunt us even till today. Issues of labor reforms continue to be elusive even today. Land reforms and issues of land related has got more complicated. Issues of social sector reforms in terms of education and in terms of health also did not occupy the kind of priority which it should. So I think that if I were to recount, we'll have to again ask ourselves a mutual question of whether the fact that we got out of the crisis so lightly in 1993 put us thereafter in a mode of complacency. And that therefore in the 10 years where Dr. Manmohan Singh, who had led these reforms as a finance minister, became the prime minister, on many of these, the movement was far less than he would himself be satisfied with.
Okay.
Mr. Singh?
Can I pursue with
Yeah, please go.
another sort of that was backward looking, NK, and let me be a little more forward looking and try and provoke you a bit, if I may. Reading your book, I was struck that even in the bad old days, long before reforms and so forth, I was struck that you were fairly consistently in favor of sort of modernization and a liberal outlook on as far as economic policy was concerned. And liberal here, by that I may include more engagement with the external world. that you favored the Indian economy become more integrated, have policies which facilitate that, and so forth. And to a large extent, as I think you would agree, what happened in the 90s and continued to happen in the 2000s for a good long time was essentially an opening up of the Indian economy, and opening up with success, I should say, not under duress, not only under crisis, but voluntarily, in the areas of trade, capital flows, technology transfer, and all those things. And we obviously reaped some good rewards from that. I have a sense, of course, I'm not in government for so many years, but I have a sense from the newspapers and so forth that in the last 2 to 3 years, some of our actions, particularly in trade policy, appear to have been reversing course, whether it comes to increasing tariffs on goods from abroad, whether it comes to not engaging as we perhaps might have in the regional comprehensive economic partnership with the rest of Asia, which just got signed, as you know, 3 days ago by 15 countries. Now, to me, this is disquieting because like all of us, I want fast and rapid economic growth for India, which provides more jobs, less poverty, and all those good things. And I don't frankly see us achieving those unless we really integrate with the rest of the world, particularly the most dynamic parts of the world, which I think today, as we see it in the last few years, and including perhaps in the immediate post-pandemic period, is going to be East and Southeast Asia. So is this a worry that you share? And if you do, how do you think we should move forward?
Shankar, it's not an easy question which you have posed, but I will just make just 3 broad observations. First and foremost, who can disagree with you or with anyone that trade must be an important engine of growth? That countries which seek to grow at 7-8% or more must really use trade, which historically we have known has been an important impetus to countries in achieving higher rates of economic growth. And countries which have followed policies which are anti-trade have really not been able to achieve the kind of growth rates which trade has brought about in terms of growth and prosperity. So there cannot be any disagreement on that. Where I have some other concerns are, second issue is, shall we ask ourselves again the question, and I'm using several times, because I think in many of this we have played it all together, Shankar, and has the world turned increasingly more protectionist? Have the great advantage, comparative factor advantages in terms and efficiency, factor efficiency of seeking better place in the value-added chain yielded place to a different model of arrangement of the international economic order? Multilateral institutions, including the World Trade Organization, and both of us have been in the WTO, is languishing. And we may continue to believe that India believes in multilateralism and multilateral institutions, but the fact remains that suddenly it has become less relevant, it seems, by the very people who practice these virtues of this, going back on it. Now, I would like to believe with you that this is a transient phase, and I would like to believe that we go back to what common sense would tell us, namely the importance of trade and trade policies in making, once again, trade as an engine of growth. We will have to wait for perhaps January to see how the new policy framework by the United States in this particular way pans itself out. Your third important point was that should we not look at, therefore, trading arrangements with nations where the benefits would be significant? Now, I think that there it would be it's somewhat naive to forget that geopolitics has an important role to play, and that we can separate geopolitics from economic choices which may be made in a kind of a sensible way. So I think that there would be a constellation of many of these. And I'd like to end by saying that while certainly we cannot afford to be a protectionist country, we need to be active partners in the gains of trade. We need to watch the transient nature in which the economics of value-added chain plays itself out. We also need to be mindful of the way in which geopolitics plays itself out.
So I can just follow up on that very interesting place we kind of left off. Dr. Singh, the relationship, I think, between government and corporates, is something that I think, you have seen so closely change and evolve in other countries much more than probably it has in India necessarily. You talk about protectionism, and we always seen that in America, the US government acts almost as agents of their businesses. They're so aggressive in how they on how they'll sell, whatever aircraft, Boeing aircrafts, defense stuff, how they'll lobby for, Harley Davidson in this, specifically for some weird reason in this past presidency. But do you see that the relationship between corporates and government in India, in this very protectionist world where we are doing app diplomacy by we sort of hold off on China by banning apps, and that this new angle, do you see now that then a natural play out will be that government and corporates in India also will be able to cultivate a much closer and a much more mutually, in a sense, beneficial relationship than has happened before in India, and much like it is in the US?
Well, there's no doubt on that, what you say, that you do require much greater fusion of partnership of government and corporate sector for promotion of economic interests in an increasingly interdependent world. I totally agree with you on that. And in fact, we have traversed quite a distance because Shankar will recall that, I should have written this in the book, that Shankar would recall that in the old days, you required organizations like the CII, long live the CII, or FICCI, and long live the FICCI, or SOCHAM, to interlocute. And because individual business corporates were not exactly the most welcome people in the corridors of decision making, you do require to hitch on to a trade body to be able to put across even legitimate points of view to government. All that has changed, I think, in a meaningful way. And the openness of engagement between decision-making process and the corporates have certainly grown. They need to grow much more because, Anant, you're quite right, that in an increasingly interdependent world, you need to really optimize the synergy between both of them, between government and the private sector. And I see much more of that happening, particularly given geopolitical uncertainties.
Is that so, Mr. Singh? If I may, the sense one gets, on the in North Block or in the corridors of power, is that corporates are not really very welcome. In the sense, not that they are not welcome. Of course, the private sector has grown phenomenally over the last 20 years. So, to say that that private sector is not welcome may not be the precise point that I want to make. But proximity to corporate or industry leaders is still seen as something which politicians or bureaucrats would want to keep themselves away from. In your book, I see, Mr. Singh could talk about, his relations with, the Ambanis, with the Tatas, with the Birlas. But how many bureaucrats today or politicians today talk about that in a manner which is which doesn't kind of invite criticism from within?
Well, let me say I can't comment on the last bits of it, which are somewhat complimentary. But let me say this: that the quality of engagement between the Prime Minister and corporate leaders in regular interactions, which he has been having quite frequently. There was one which you remember where he just about 15 days ago get invited a group, is the new pattern. And I think that the corporates have an easier access to the top decision making much more freely than if I reflect back in my time. And this is because I think there's much greater and more easy relationship between the corporate sector interest, not being at variance necessarily. And also because I think that Shankar would bear me out, that as we moved away from direct controls into regulatory framework, you now have independent regulators in a whole host of activity. Shankar would recall that the controller of capital issues used to be a formidable office. The chief controller of imports and exports used to be a formidable entity, where they, if you remember, in the days of the Commerce Ministry, the office of the CCINE, as he used to be called, or all that has been replaced by a species of regulators. The issue really in the regulatory issue framework is to prevent regulatory capture and to ensure regulatory independence. That is a problematic one, and how to make sure that they remain neutral and depoliticized is a challenge as we go forward. But I think that I would tend to believe that looking back in the long journey in public policy making, the trust component between private sector and government has certainly deepened and broadened, and suspicions are much less, given the fact that the reforms have also created the new species and entities of independent regulators.
Okay, if I might pick you up on something which is sort of a sotto voce in your book, but in 2 or 3 places there were sentences like, you know, a fading tribe, in a sense, when you're talking in complimentary terms about a senior civil servant, either in the economic domain or the security policy domain, as if it's a vanishing tribe in the sense of men of great quality and ability. You don't actually make this comment, I think, as far as I can recall, directly, but I did sense that underneath it is a sort of concern that the quality of the senior civil service, which must, as if you go back to our earlier discussion on forms of government, that whatever form of government you have in the modern day and age, the quality of the mandarins, if you like, has to be good for things to work well. Let me put my cards on the table. I don't have as long a history in government as you do. I was only there 15, 16 years. But of course, I'm an observer of all this, and my father too, like yours, was ICS and all that. But my sense is that and I'm talking here of the average, not just of the outstanding. My sense is the average quality of the senior civil service that we now have is distinctively less good than it was, say, 50 years ago. Or 55 years ago when you entered service. First, would you agree with that assessment, which is sort of lurking in your book? You don't actually say that flat out, I don't think. And if you do, because if you do, it's a serious issue. What should one do about it? I mean, we've had all these different administrative reforms commissions and so on to solve various issues, but it's not clear to me that a great deal has emerged from them in terms of implementation, or whether there are other solutions we should be looking for.
It's a very complex issue, Shankar, and you recognize more than anyone else that not amiable to any simple answers, which would be quite naive looking at the complexities. But yes, I have mentioned the fact that, and that is also connected in the chapter on the Prime Minister's office and the evolution of the Prime Minister's office, if you recall, that the fact that within a span of 4 months, 4 very important, well-recognized civil servants were transferred out of the positions in which they had acquired great domain knowledge was at a signaling effect to the system, that what really mattered was not their domain knowledge, but it was the Prime Minister's office at that time, which I have mentioned quite starkly, which marked a watershed. And that marked a watershed, therefore, which is there, which you allude to, and there is no shying away from that. Now, your second question of the fact that do I lament necessarily the fact that the new breed of civil servants or the new civil servants who are in important positions do not match up to what they were earlier? I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, because my own experience seems to be that given an opportunity, the present class of civil servants, both intellectually, in terms of acumen, domain knowledge, are in no way inferior or less bright than existed earlier. And it would be somewhat unfair to say that by way of skills, they are any inferior to the group that, I mean, I, for instance, felt in my own generation, and since your father was that, I felt that maybe we were not as good, or they felt we were not as good. And it's part of human nature that we feel that the next set of people may or may not be as good. But the third and last point, what does one do to improve the way in which skills and quality is recognized? Should meritocracy be judged by systems and methodologies which are transparent, and should that be respected? Do we need how to usher a merit-based order? Now, in a complex society like ours, which has many other problems of social inclusiveness and so on, one shouldn't really commit the mistake of trying to give answers, which, as I said, will look to be very naive. But yes, it is an issue that needs to be addressed. Successive administrative reforms committee or commissions, which you mentioned, have not been able to do so. And it is an important issue which should remain a high priority concern in the affairs of public policy.
I think, you mentioned the next generation of bureaucrats. If I can draw you to the next generation of politicians, you've just seen, again, it's just amazing the amount of exposure you've had to the political life and the kind of parties, the families that you've met or interacted with, the kind of political leaders you have. One of the things that strike me, and I can say this as a as a third generation heir myself, that the next generation of political leaders all over the country, with a few exceptions like Jagan Reddy or whatever, there are a few exceptions, but most of the next generation political leaders arguably aren't ready or aren't showing signs of really filling the shoes of the fathers or the parents, the grandparents, whoever, that they're actually inheriting. Would you agree with that notion? And if that is, why do you think that is?
Well, Anant, I think that I'm proud of the fact that you are the third generation, and you have a huge legacy to be proud of. But I think that it would be, an oversimplification to make a generalization of this kind. For instance, let me give you 2 or 3 examples. I, for instance, feel that some chief ministers were certainly far more proactive on development frontiers than some of their predecessors. I cannot think of a chief minister of Gujarat who have bettered the long years of Mr. Modi's decisions which he had taken. Or, for instance, I think that some of the chief ministers which were there in Maharashtra are really. But so it's very difficult, in my view, with one brush, to say that they are, as a class, less competent.
Sorry, I'll just interrupt you to just say that I'm asking about the families, the people who are, you know, the next generation political leader of the same family.
I see.
Who are inheriting, you know, their parents or their grandparents or that legacy.
Let me say, without taking names, and I could take a couple of names.
Please do take a few names.
I would say, for instance, that the academic embellishments, if I may use that expression, of say someone like Jyotiraditya Scindia, is no inferior to the academic qualifications of the father, Madhav Rao Scindia, whom I knew well, or the grandmother, whom I also knew well. Or for instance, I think that the academic embellishments of someone like Sachin Pilot is no inferior to what his father had. So I think in general, the newer generation is in fact improving. I'll give you another state example. Digvijay Singh's son, Jayavardhan Singh, who is a minister, was a minister in the Kamal Nath government till recently. Professor Jagdish Bhagwati at Harvard introduced Jayavardhan to me and said that he is one of our brightest students in at Columbia University. So one could go on taking examples. In general, I find that the newer generation of the political species, the same family, are better educated, more talented, and more in tune.
But do they have the same ground connect that, you know, on the platforms that have been created for that they're standing on? And can they grow into it?
Well, that also again varies. For instance, to give an example, which I had, of course, Mr. Jyotiraditya Scindia's entry into the political foray was an accident because his father died very suddenly and he was pulled out. But take someone like Sachin Pilot, again, is the fact that his father had died in a car accident. But take someone like, say, Jayavardhan. He became an MLA and ground himself as an MLA to connect with the people before he became a minister in the cabinet of Kamal Nath. Or, for instance, I must tell you that in the tours of states, and they have been the most fascinating part of the Finance Commission's work, I have met of many sarpanches who have I have been quite taken aback that they are quite happy. I went to Rajasthan, met a sarpanch of quite educated, well-grounded in the roots. So I think that A, they are better educated, B, they are being able to come down to the roots of from where they must nourish their political power.
Do you see that academia and populist ideas, popular views are actually turning more and more sort of at odds with each other?
I would say not really, because I think that Shankar and I, we have participated in so many international conferences where there is a kind of a blend between the political entities and the academia. Give you two just quick examples. Take the Stanford Conference. It was held for 17 years. It was a mix between politicos, for successive finance ministers were all there. There was US academic. Take, for instance, a conference which we had for many years ago, and Shankar used to read serious papers in the Neem Rana Conference. I found that it was a good blend between academia and a blend also of policymakers. So I would say that I see the future as a more interactive process between academia and policymakers. The fact that newspapers like the Indian Express on the 2 pages actively promote the ideas page, many articles written by academia, many articles written by political entities, and the articles written by academia are written by political entities because they are being talked about. So I see a greater and a more healthy interactive process than existed earlier.
Mr. Singh, if I may just draw you to the book again, one of the interesting things that you talk about in the book is about on banking nationalization, bank nationalization during Indira Gandhi's time. And you point to your father, how he was opposed to it, and as finance secretary, and probably was not even kept in the loop because of his known opposition at that point of time. So we have come a long way. Do you think that in banking or financial sector reforms in general, uh, have it seems that we, what are your views? Have we done enough? And I would like Dr. Acharya also to chip in.
Well, frankly, I feel that we have not done enough on banking and financial sector reforms. And this is notwithstanding many changes which have taken place. I think that, for instance, trying to give greater autonomy to banks, the insolvency bill was a very, very major step, the exit process, the culture of evergreening, which many banks have begun to follow, that has come to wear off. But if you want to ask me the question that have we allowed the freedom and flexibility for really new entrants to come to the banking and financial sector, avoiding the conflict of interest between industrial houses who own them and then begin to control the banks also, which was one of the factors, by the way, which led to the nationalization of banks. But the short answer would be that this was, in my view, a can kicked down the street. When the crisis of 1991 had come, we appointed this Narasimhan committee report, which Shankar was very connected with, and then there's a second version of that. But I don't think that the reforms which have been undertaken are something which really are the best for the 21st century India.
So what would you like to, like if you were the finance minister today, what would be the things on the agenda for banking reforms?
Well, first and foremost, to complete the ongoing reforms which are there, which are really banking amalgamation is taking place. The Indradhanush program, which this government adopted shortly after it came to power, many ingredients of that Indradhanush program need to be completed in a significant way. We need to have greater accountability of shareholders. We need to accord the banks the necessary autonomy which they like, and then look at the manner and modalities in which, based on rules of transparency, room can be provided and space can be given for new entrants who can add to the competitive efficiency of financial intermediation.
Dr. Acharya?
Yeah, I mean, I would, on the whole, want to have gone further than what NK has just done, my own personal views. I've long felt that our experimentation with essentially a public sector owned banking system dominantly, which is still the case, 65 to 70% of total assets and liabilities are held by government banks or government majority owned banks, hasn't really worked. That every few years we have to recapitalize them because they're just kind of on the ropes, not making enough money for what they need to do, and the capital has been eaten away by bad loans and so forth. And this has been a recurring phenomenon. It's not just in the last few years. It's been going on certainly since the 1980s and 90s. And I think that no government so far has really bitten the bullet. I think the nearest we came to a bullet being bitten was, I think, during Mr. Vajpayee's tenure, when, if memory serves me right, and NK can correct me, in the finance ministry, a bill was drafted, or at least a cabinet note was drafted, which would have amended the relevant banking legislation in a way that the minimum 51% ownership would be reduced to 33%. And this would, at the same time, there was language about maintaining the public character of banks or something like that. But I mean, once you change the ownership pattern, things change. That's a fact of life. Unfortunately, in my view, it never saw, I mean, I cannot now remember, you can remind me, NK, whether that actually became legislation that was introduced which didn't go anywhere, or whether it was a cabinet note which kind of didn't go very far. but that's the fact, and that's the closest we've come to what I would regard as the desirable outcome, which is gradually. Nothing has to be done overnight. Nothing can be done overnight. Let's be realistic. Let us not be naive, as NK is accusing us to be sometimes. That we should really, essentially, do what we've done in other sectors: privatize, not just do offers for sale and reduce the number of shares held in the public sector, but privatize one or two of our now amalgamated public sector banks, and see what happens. It's not an easy process. I entirely accept that, but I think the time has come, because otherwise we know the cycle. 3 years down the road, we recapitalize again.
Yeah. Can I make a brief comment? That's not a story, Shankar, I have written. I have deliberately abstained from writing, but I don't mind reciting that story. So you are absolutely right that the closest we came was at the time of Mr. Vajpayee at that time. And then I must complete the story, because then at that time there was huge opposition from the Congress party. And then the Prime Minister had at that time called me and said that I should go and try and persuade my former boss. And it took me a little few minutes to get him out to say that he wanted me to go and see the former finance minister under whom I had worked, to try and see whether the thinking in the Congress party could be aligned. And that is when they felt that there was a high probability of this legislation seeing the light of the day. Dutifully, I did do so. And the outcome was that spare me this one, because there is no consensus within the party on an issue of this kind, and that people continue to have the nostalgia of the circumstances under which the nationalization of banks were undertaken. So I think that, Shankar, you prodded my memory, and that's the story.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Deliberately not written that, and that special visit which I made at and that's how it did not therefore come up to a cabinet kind of a framework. But Shankar, who can disagree with you that the path forward would be, at least in the case of one or two banks, to move forward in being able to do away with the kind of present ownership structure which we have inherited from a decision, and that if you look back historically, maybe that decision may have served its purpose, and we need to move on.
I think the last question, Vaidi, but you and I can ask, and then we'll probably try to get to the audience. Lots of questions and a great audience we've got. Mr. Singh, again, I'm going to ask one last piece, and I'm going to put you on the spot. You've seen so much of politics play out in India. You've seen political parties, political legacies start and stop. What do you see is going wrong in the Congress, and where do you see what do you see is next for the Congress party?
I can't give you an answer because I don't know one. I'm not trying to be politically correct. I have no reasons to be. But I think that I really, frankly, do not know what coherent reply to give you. I mean, it's easy enough to say that the Congress must genuinely become more democratic and look for leadership which is more broad based. But I do not know whether that is the answer.
Let me try to push you and say, have you seen any political party in a situation like this in India before?
Well, if you look at the fact that, if I asked you the reverse question and asked you to tickle your own memory, what was the lowest number of parliamentary seats that the BJP got once?
But the BJP again didn't.
So there you are. The BJP at one stage had done so badly as to get a rather low number of parliamentary seats. And I think if my memory serves me correct, Mr. Vajpayee himself had lost it. an election. But that did not prevent the party from rejuvenating itself and to come up to where it has become as the most dominant party. So other political parties have gone through this phenomena earlier, but have reinvented, rejuvenated, and restructured themselves in a manner which is really quite for us to see as part of the evolution of political history.
Sure. Vairi, should we go to the audience, or do you want to ask one last?
Just one last question. I thought it was my own curiosity about the book and Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, what made you sit down and write this book?
Oh, thank you very much, Vaidi, for asking that question, because I was hoping that someone would ask. Let me say, I have, when I look back on, and this is something that Shankar will also have some empathy with. When I look back on the generation of the iconic civil servants, look at people like LK Jha, LP Singh, own father, many others, KB Lal, none of them were left behind a scrap of paper. They would have seen a lot of India's economic struggle in the first few years of India's independence. And they would have lots to say in comparison. But I felt that since circumstances had placed me where I could see and witness a lot of these, the drama of political decision-making, the political economy being the overarching influence in the decision-making process, I felt that some of it needed to be written and recounted. So it was really, I would not say the failing, but it was a realization that the generation which went before me had not really left behind manuscripts and writings which are of worthy nature, and that we need to correct perhaps this, looking at the fact that those are parts of Indian economic and political history which are important and relevant enough to be put down on a piece of paper.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think we'll get to the audience. Can I ask Mr. Kirit Parekh, Chairman of the Integrated Research and Action for Development, to ask the first question? And after that, we'll call on Mr. Jitu Punjabi and then Mr. Mudit Jain. Mr. Parekh, if you can please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
I have done that.
And please turn your video on. And ask
it is on, and I've done that.
Okay,
NK, you have had a distinguished career, and you have been over so many positions of various influences. And you have been a member of the Planning Commission. You have been also chairman of the Finance Commission. And I remember in the 70s when my friend and colleague Bagich Minhas resigned from the Planning Commission as one member of the Finance Commission. He said that the Finance Commission is more important than the Planning Commission because we are allocating more funds to the states than the Planning Commission does. I don't know what you think about this. And the second question I would like to ask you is, we have recognized the importance of a very educated population and healthcare and other things, as well as the importance of research and development. And how come our allocations on these have been so meager and have far from adequate in these areas? And what is it? None of the parties have really taken, none of the governments have really pushed this in the way it could have been done and it should have been done.
Okay, Kirit, thanks for asking that question, both of them. Now, first, your first question. Now, if you look at the debates on the relative role of Finance Commission and the Planning Commission, you will find that up to the 13th Finance Commission, there was an invariable lament that the Planning Commission was an extra constitutional entity, and that therefore the Finance Commission was being inhibited in the discharge of its constitutional obligation under Article 280, under which it is constituted, because in practice, the Finance Commission kept doing only with non-planned resources, whereas the gross budgetary support which was given through the Planning Commission, namely the plan expenditure, was a prerogative of the Planning Commission. And I think that that lament, fortunately, was over with the abolition of the Planning Commission, and the Finance Commission was in no way inhibited by that particular constraint. But that, of course, whether there is a permanent institutional mechanism for a dialogue between the center and the states is a larger issue, which this has opened. And whether, in the absence of the Planning Commission, the current functions of the Niti Aayog enable this very important consultative mechanism between the center and the states to be purposefully used is a much broader issue on which I would not like to give a very simple answer. So the fact remains that the first point which you have raised is an important point on the relative functions of the Planning Commission and the Finance Commission. Your second point about education and health. Yes, there can be no doubt that these have been in the past neglected. In fact, in the Finance Commission's recommendations on the health sector, we have made some important recommendations, particularly given the context of the pandemic, that the public outlay on health, which is in comparison not only to our needs, but in comparison to our other peer group, is around 1% of GDP, whereas successively we have taken targets of a total public outlay comprising of center and the states of around 2.4 to 2.5% of the GDP. And that this has been, in my view, I agree with you, something which should have received much higher priority, and should do so as we go forward. So I think that the implementation of the new education policy, the NEP 20, which has come after 30 years, and the fact that in terms of the new health policy of 2017, which I think is very relevant, particularly in the pandemic context, these past inadequate public outlays need to be rectified as also an enabling framework for a more purposeful public-private partnership. Because who will like to put money in education, for instance, if, for instance, any profits from out of higher educational activity is considered sinful in the eyes of the lawmakers? So I think that we need to really look at both public and private outlays in important areas of health and education.
Can I hear Mr. Jitu Punjabi, CEO of EM Capital Advisors?
Yeah, Mr. Singh, thank you very much. I was trying to unmute myself. Really appreciate the opportunity. And I've held you in very high respect over these years. So it's really wonderful to see you write this book and talk about your story. I've got one big question, and it's a very fundamental question from an economic standpoint for India, which I'm really, really worried about. So if over the last 5 years, if you see what's happening is you're seeing savings rates for the country go down at a time when you should be monetizing its demographic dividend. You should be actually seeing savings rates go up as you see this new pool of young population contribute to the savings pool and see that number go up as we saw in China. The implication of this partly, or the causation of this partly, in my view, is some draconian policies on tax laws, as well as, a lot of very wealthy individuals, as per some Credit Suisse report, 20,000 very rich Indians have become NRIs, and these NRIs are no longer adding to the savings pool, and they're no longer adding to the job, they're no longer creating jobs. And at a time like this, I think we're at a time when there's a war for talent, there's a war for investment globally, with driving so many of our job makers away, job creators away. Do you see that as a concern? And do you see that this is a giant policy misstep for India, just purely from a national interest standpoint?
Well, let me say that first, two very brief comments. First, there is no doubt that for growth rates to grow up to around 8%, which is what we would like, both the savings investment ratio and the incremental capital output ratio based on total factor productivity and various other efficiencies, they need to significantly go up if India's growth rates is to really climb back to what would be necessary to sustain India's national priorities and other objectives. So there's no question and no differences of opinion on that. On the second one, of whether how draconian our tax laws are, is a much wider question. Our tax rates, particularly on our corporate tax rates now, are perhaps internationally comparative. I think that in terms of the rates themselves, they compare themselves far favorably. I, as Revenue Secretary, had tried to do this and miserably failed, because whereas the income tax rates, one was able to rationalize, the corporate tax rates really remained misaligned with the international averages. Fortunately, that has been done. Now, whether in the tax administration, there is an element of undue harshness and undue terrorism, if you may want to use a pejorative expression, there is no doubt that tax administration needs to become based on greater trust and greater friendliness. And that is necessary not only to prevent the outflow of talent, which you mentioned, but to, in fact, to get more talent into the country and get more foreign investments into it. So one relates to the rates, the other relates to the administration of the entire tax ethos, which I do believe needs to become based on much greater trust and much greater friendliness.
I think we'll take 2 questions at a time, just in the interest of time, Mr. Singh, if you don't mind. If I can ask Mr. Ashok Khemka, Principal Secretary, Government of Haryana, and after him, if I can ask Mr. Sanjay Pugalia, Editor Director, The Quint. Mr. Khemka, can you unmute yourself and turn your camera on and just ask the question? Mr. Khemka?
Yes, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes.
Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Yeah.
Yes. My question to Mr. Singh is that GST was a big taxation reform. I would just like to know that how big a reform it was in the light of evidence, that is, what was the level of the cascading effect of taxes in the pre-GST regime? Is there any study in this regard? And in the post-GST regime, that is in the present GST regime, have tax collections improved as a percentage of GDP?
Okay. The first question
was... Mr. Singh, I can just take a second question also. You can answer 2 together.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, please.
Mr. Sanjay Pugalia, if you can...
Good evening, sir. You have just finished your report on Finance Commission, and you have spoken to all the states. What are they saying about the federalism, spirit of federalism? Is the quotient going up or going down?
Okay. So first question first. Do I consider GST to be an important path-breaking economic reform? The answer is a categorical yes. I do consider it to be a path-breaking important international reforms. In fact, as I was looking back, as Khemka, to my past notes, and I find that one of the performance criteria or one of the structural reforms of the 91 reforms was some kind of a tax structure of this kind involving excise of states and the central government. And from that time, it took a long time for this to be enacted in 2017. Is this a perfect GST? Surely not. And that is a real issue. The implementation of the GST needs still is an ongoing process. I really think that 3 important changes in the GST are necessary. One, we need to really have much greater rate rationalization. There are far too many rates. You need broad banding. You need broad banding into the bulk of it, and you need to really move to a regime which is genuinely revenue neutral. Now, you can have some disagreement on what is the most ideal revenue neutral rate, but my memory suggests that when I had left the Ministry of Finance at that time, we were talking in terms of 15%, 16% as a revenue neutral rate. And there needs to be a merit rate and a demerit rate, and this needs a major simplification. We need to get rid of exemptions. we need to get rid of, improve the quality of invoice matching, improve the quality of technology in terms of ensuring much greater compliance, because estimates suggested to us in the Finance Commission, we had got some objective papers done. For instance, in the paper done by the IMF, it was pointed out to us that the nearly 4 to 5% of GDP was missing out really in terms of being captured through various taxation instruments. So does GST need a reform as you go forward? Yes. Was GST a major fundamental reform? Yes. To the second question that was asked of me by Sanjay, I found that it wouldn't come to you as a surprise, Sanjay, that if no state government was happy with what the 14th Finance Commission had given, namely 42%, each one of them would be happier with a figure like 50%. If you ask the union, that the union was neither happy with the 13th nor the 14th, with the kind of resources that were left. So it's a balancing act of reconciling these two divergent objectives. And that's what the Finance Commission is all about. And that's what we have endeavored to do. And you will have to perhaps show some forbearance till this report is laid on the table of the House with an action taken report on how we have sought to balance the objectives of the center and the states. But I can certainly say that all state governments reiterated their confidence in the working of fiscal federalism.
Mr. Singh, if I may just follow it up on federalism, which you also mentioned as we spoke about, how while you are seeing a strong prime minister, similarly, there are some of the state chief ministers are also very strong personalities, and elections probably are won on their names. At a time of, say, pandemic, or with the change in the entire revenue sharing mechanism post GST, how do you see the center-state relations now? Is there a sense that it has gone more shrill? Does that worry you as we go forward? Because states have to be equal partners, if not more, in kind of ensuring 8 to 9% GDP growth rate.
Well, Vaidhi, I have two very brief comments to make. First, having toured all the states, I do believe that federalism as a concept is philosophically far more broad-based than fiduciary federalism. That federalism must not only be embedded in resources being shared between the center and the states. There needs to be greater partnership on the achievement of national priorities between the center and the states. Indeed, the cooperation with the states extended to the efforts of the central government in dealing with this pandemic is one example of a federalism in action beyond limited fiduciary obligations, because it dealt with human lives and dealt with livelihood. So that is one broad comment. My second very broad comment on federalism, since you raised this issue, that I did allude in my comments to your earlier question of yours, that do we need a different institutional mechanism for continuing dialogue between the center and the states after the abolition of the Planning Commission? Perhaps the Niti Aayog can be restructured, perhaps the Center State Council can be rejuvenated, or perhaps I think a different kind of a structure, institutional structure, needs to be crafted, which does allow the center and the states to be in continuous dialogue with them, so that each one can have a particular voice. Other countries have different models. Like, for instance, if you look at the other federations, Australia, South Africa, and others have a permanent finance commission in which they look into this kind of annual basis. They look into expenditure outlays, evaluation of expenditure outlays, and their allocations along that line.
Can I ask Mr. Samir Barde, CEO of the Online Rummy Federation? And then after him, I'd like to ask Mr. Vivek Jain, Director of DCW, please. Mr. Barde, if you can unmute yourself, turn your camera on.
I've unmuted. I'm on a low bandwidth, so I'll avoid turning my camera on, otherwise I might drop off. Thank you so much, sir, for amazing 1 hour. So I had a question related to the sector that we work with, and we're really in the online skill gaming business. So as you're aware, real money online games of skill like fantasy and rummy, etc., are exploding, and they're new business economies. But due to the current status, we only play IGST, leaving very little interest in states to support this new business stream. I'm sure there are other digital businesses that have the same or similar problems. So we were wondering how tax revenues could be shared so that the center and state would both be equally motivated to encourage digital businesses like ours.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vivek Jain, Director, DCW.
Anand, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Sir, just a simple question that being part of industry, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was largely credited by starting India's reform process, I think in the 90s, which resulted many years of high GDP growth. India's GDP growth has been declining from last year, and post-pandemic it has dropped even further, and naturally so. Any fiscal measures the government is thinking with the Finance Ministry or the Planning Commission to revive demand and get the struggling Indian corporate sector back on its feet by fiscal measures such as increasing import duties or reviewing FTAs, because it's going to be a long haul and it's been a struggling year, and any comments you would like to make on that?
Okay, I think that first question, I think fortunately I'm not the Revenue Secretary of India, and I think that your suggestions of how revenues can be mutually augmented by bringing more activities in the GST is an important question which should be addressed to the Ministry of Finance. It would be not fair on my part to make a comment on a subject with which I'm not too familiar with. The second question of what really can be done, I would think that the issue of a fiscal stimulus is one which is under continuing review. Even 10 days ago, the finance minister unveiled the next part of our fiscal package, as they say. You mentioned about the fact of the monetary policies. So I think that if monetary and fiscal policies clearly need to act in tandem for a significant revival of the Indian economy, I do believe that having achieved whatever growth rates we would this year, there is no doubt that we would end the year with a negative in the nominal terms. We do not know what Q3 and Q4 would turn out to be, but the sharper the contraction this year, the greater would be the rebound next year. The question really is that in the going forward beyond that, what kind of a growth rates do I see? I see that if the current ongoing reforms are implemented, I see us getting back to the higher growth trajectory in the latter part in the post-pandemic period. On the fiscal stimulus itself, I would make just one comment per se, if I might, taking advantage of Shankar's presence here, that let's not forget the fact that the combined fiscal deficit of the center and the states today, what do you think they are? They are perhaps above 10% of GDP, clearly. So that's the fiscal stimulus available in the system, which is being augmented at every turn of the events. What do you think is the cost of the forbearance shown by the monetary authorities? They are not costless. They have significant costs. And if you add, therefore, both these, it would be, in my view, not fair to conclude that there is inadequacy of monetary, either monetary forbearance or fiscal action.
I think we'll take one last question from the audience, and then Vaidi and I will wrap it up with a couple of closing thoughts and comments from you. Mr. Mudit Jain, please. Sorry, Managing Director, DCW Limited. Mr. Mudit Jain. Great, if you can turn your camera on as well.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Goenka. So Oxford and Cambridge teach a very popular degree course called Tripos on philosophy, politics, and economy. India, despite having exemplary philosophical thinking and has given the world yoga and meditation a perfect understanding on the human physiognomy, why hasn't this excellence translated into good governance and into a developed nation? Our ways of working are antediluvian, and we have the lowest per capita incomes in Asia. Why this disconnect between philosophy and reality, sir? Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Singh.
Well, if you are mentioning that we need to have two things embedded in your question. One is that the PPE course at Oxford should be something which we should also consider here. I'm sure the flexibility given in the NEP would prompt many educational institutions to have courses similar to the course that Oxford is pursuing for long. And I know of many people, many friends of mine, many relations of mine who have PPE from Oxford and have done well for themselves. It's a good blend of politics, philosophy, and economics. Your second question of why hasn't that kind of a learning replicated itself in the governance of the country? Well, there are many complex reasons, some of which are based on legacy. Some of the issues why they are not, in terms of the kind of governance and other economic reforms, are the kind of issues which I have endeavored to address in my particular book. And I hope that when you do get an opportunity to read them, you'll find a more detailed answer to some of these issues which legitimately and very rightly concern you.
Mr. Singh, I'll just ask the last question. Unless Vaidi, do you have something you want to ask, Vaidi? Did I see your hand up or something?
Yeah, I can go on, but I'll ask one question. Yeah.
Go ahead, Vaidi.
Yeah. So, this is one thing which kind of looking at, last 30, 40 years of policy making and governments in place, we have a majority single party majority government for the last 6 years, and the opposition space seems to be shrinking. So I wanted to get your views on what does it mean for economic policy making? How does it play out in the economy? With a very strong government at the center, little opposition.
Well, I think that clearly you can argue on the merits and demerits of majoritarian forms of government, which have less of the kind of check and balances in which opposition parties are comparatively much more strident than seems to be numerically in the numbers currently. So that's the aspect of whether the checks and balances are which are not there in majoritarian forms of government, is it desirable or not. But to your sharp question, which is there, certainly the assured parliamentary majority, unlike coalition governments, which was a question that Anant had asked very rightly at the beginning, it does give the government an opportunity to undertake economic reforms and measures, which governments which are more dependent on coalition partners would find it more difficult to take. So it is a challenge and an opportunity that stable political parties and stable political governments which are not dependent on a whole host. And now I think that with the changing configuration, even in the upper house, even though money bills were never subject to the upper house's decisions, but a whole host of things, even in the upper house, it looks as though the government will have, the NDA will have a majority. So I think it certainly provides an opportunity to undertake deeper and far-reaching economic reforms, which were stymied by the absence of parliamentary majorities.
Great. I'll ask the last question and then we can wrap up, Mr. Singh. I just want to come back, and we couldn't complete this bit that I wanted to talk to you about, again, the relationship between corporate and governments. Now, if you see all over the world, again, at one point in time in America, a 5 to 6% control of any market was considered too much control, and antitrust proceedings would start. Today we're living in a world where each and every industry, you're talking about 20-30% controlled by single companies, especially in the digital world, where 90% of the market is often controlled by one or two players. Is this something that you think, and this concerns you about India, or is it something that you think is, we have a really long way to go, and right now we should only be sitting and encouraging and giving more wings to corporates rather than be concerned about things like competition, things like too little competition?
Well, let me put it that we are in a dynamic situation. We are in an evolving phase. But I would say that certainly there is need for the Competition Commission of India, whose primary objective for setting up an independent competition commission was to exactly deal with the issues of this kind. And I think that it is really, they are duty bound by the nature of and the objectives which the Competition Commission. In addition to independent regulators, you have a regulatory framework for the entire digital and telecom world. You have other independent regulators. So I think the regulators must act in tandem with the Competition Commission to prevent this kind of a market abuse or predatory pricing or many other evils associated with excessive market dominance. But certainly there are no simple answers to what you say, because we are in an evolving phase, but that is no ruse for the regulators who are duty bound under the law to look to the objectives why they were created to undertake the necessary decisions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Singh, for your time and for this wonderful book. I've really enjoyed going through it. Thank you, Dr. Acharya, for your incredible experience and your words of wisdom as well to us. And thank you to the audience for being with us. It's been an incredible conversation. I've had a great time. I hope you've had one too. And until the next Express Adda, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.